Well, guys, we made it. Made it to the end of the year, made it to the end of the Civil War, and now our last lecture is going to talk about the Reconstruction era of the Civil War. So before we actually get started with the lecture, I just want to say I'm really disappointed that we don't have class because we would have had a hoedown, we would have had a Civil War potluck, we would have had a lot of fun things that would have happened in class this week, but unfortunately, since we're remote, we can't do those things. So let's go ahead and get on with lecture. And let's talk about the Reconstruction era of the Civil War. So the Reconstruction is a period officially of 12 years long that went from the end of the Civil War, which was 1865, through to 1877. So this was a 12-year period. The Reconstruction was a 12-year period. Now, I do want to remind you that the Reconstruction for the Civil War was kind of unique when it comes to one nation kind of conquering another nation. Nobody was actually killed or put on trial for having been a part of the Confederate States of America. President Jefferson Davis was held in prison for a short period of time, but he never got put on trial, and he never ended up getting any punishment for having been the president of the Confederate States of America. So this is a good legacy that we have from the Reconstruction. No heads rolled. No one was punished for having been involved in the Confederate States. All right, so let's talk about the need for Reconstruction. First, we're going to talk about the way things were in the North. The North had very little property damage. Industry continued to grow, immigration was continuing to come into the North, so really the North was pretty much fine after the Civil War. Not so much the South. The situation in the South was completely different. First of all, there was huge property damage. Make sure you're taking notes on this slide. Most of the fighting had happened in the South. Remember, we talked about Grant coming down and destroying Vicksburg and Richmond and all kinds of different places. We have Sherman marching from Atlanta, Georgia, all the way to Savannah, and then up the coast towards Richmond also. Sheridan destroyed the Shenandoah Valley, and others had destroyed major cities. Atlanta was destroyed, Columbia was destroyed, Richmond was destroyed. Fields were destroyed, homes and businesses and railroads were destroyed. So there was huge amounts of property damage in the South. Because of all this property damage, there was also a dead economy. The other problem that was going on with the economy was that the Confederate dollars were worthless, and there was very little United States of America cash available in the South. So the economy was in a huge, horrible situation. Add to that the need to integrate these freed slaves, which are known as freemen. There were 4 million former slaves that had just recently been freed. They needed to find jobs. Most of them didn't want to work for their former masters for obvious reasons, and plus the former masters couldn't pay them because they had no money. So the freemen didn't have jobs, they couldn't get credit, and they faced violence for not wanting to act like slaves anymore. So another problem was the need to re-establish state governments. The federal government removed all the Confederate governments, and now these governments needed to be replaced, and they had tons and tons of problems trying to get replaced and trying to form some organization. So as you can see, the South was in a very dire situation. There were 3 phases of Reconstruction. The first phase was the presidential Reconstruction, which went from 1865 to 1867, and that was started by President Lincoln and continued on by President Johnson. Then we come to phase 2, which was 1867 to 1876, the radical or the congressional Reconstruction. And there was a final phase, which as you can see lasted a much longer time, which was the Bourbon or Reformers Reconstruction. We're really only going to focus on the radical Reconstruction, but you do need to know that there were 3 different phases. And also I want to take a moment to say here, I honestly believe that the Reconstruction would have gone very, very differently if President Lincoln had not been assassinated. If President Lincoln had been in power and President Lincoln had been running the Reconstruction, I think things might have gone a lot smoother. But God is in control, and God allowed President Lincoln to be assassinated for some reason. I have no idea, but we got to trust that God's got a plan. This section here comes from section 2, which you didn't read, but I do want you to have an idea of what President Lincoln's plan was for Reconstruction. It didn't end up really getting implemented. First, President Lincoln had the 10% plan, and he created that even before the Civil War was won. The 10% plan was created in 1863, and that plan offered pardons to former Confederates who took an oath of allegiance to the Constitution. President Lincoln's plan was very easy for Confederates to become members of the United States of America again. And that's part of the reason why the radical Republicans didn't like it very much. And once 10% of the voters took this oath of allegiance to the Constitution, the state could form a new government and it could start getting back on its feet. So that was President Lincoln's plan. But like I said, President Lincoln wasn't around to carry out his plan, and so things didn't go the way that he had envisioned they would go. And they were a lot rockier, as we're going to see. So quickly, I want you to review the 13th Amendment on page 302. There are 3 amendments to the Constitution that go with the Civil War: the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. You need to know all 3. So first of all, write down the 13th Amendment was the amendment that ended slavery in the United States of America. 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. So now we're moving into talking about the radical Reconstruction, which was led by the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. And those were Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. And they were members of the Senate. So in Congress, the radical Republicans were able to get a 2/3 majority. This is very, very significant because that meant that any piece of legislation that the president vetoed, the Republicans could come back in and override the presidential veto, and pretty much they were able to do whatever they wanted, unless the Supreme Court stepped in and said that a law was unconstitutional. So this 2/3 majority is extremely significant because they could override the presidential vetoes. 2/3 majority, important because they could override President Johnson's vetoes. There you go. If you didn't write it down already, make sure you do write it down. 2/3 majority, override the president's vetoes. All right. So the Congress created an agency in March of 1865 called the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, freemen were former slaves. Make sure you know that. Write it down somewhere. Freemen were former slaves. Freeman was the name for former slaves. The goal of the Freedmen's Bureau was a relief agency designed to help the former slaves and also as aid for refugees. So this was the first time the federal government set up an aid agency. They were able to do a lot of really good things. They provided rations and food and clothing to freed slaves and also poor whites. They tried to help people find jobs. They protected the employees from the employers exploiting them. They were able to establish schools and hospitals for blacks in the South. So lots of really good things happened. Then in 1866, so 1 year after the Freedmen's Bureau was created, Congress voted to expand the Bureau, but President Johnson vetoed the bill and Congress overrode the veto. We're going to start seeing this is going to be a trend. The struggle that the Freedmen's Bureau faced was it was plagued with corruption. So like I said, there were some good things that happened because of the Freedmen's Bureau, but there was also a lot of corruption involved. There was a lot of corruption happening in the country during this time period, the Reconstruction era. All right, so now we come to the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted a full citizenship to blacks. I'm sure you can guess what happened. President Johnson vetoed the act. Like I said, we're going to start seeing a trend. President Johnson just didn't veto the act because he didn't like it. He vetoed the act because he thought it was unconstitutional. He thought that state governments and not the federal government should control citizenship. Well, Congress overrode the veto, but they were afraid that the Supreme Court might agree with President Johnson that granting citizenship to blacks was not a federal right, so they took things one step further. And Congress proposed the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment did 4 things, and you need to know all 4 of those things. So, first, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to all people living in the United States at that time. So, 14th Amendment, citizenship to all people living in the United States. It based representation in Congress on the entire state's population, therefore getting rid of the 3/5 clause, where slaves counted as 3/5 of a person for taxation and representation purposes. So now representation is based on the entire state's population, which is the way that it should be. If you need to keep copying this, pause, because I'm going to go on to the other 2 parts of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment also prohibited former Confederates from holding office. So if they had been in the Confederate government, they were not allowed to run for office under the new state governments. And finally, it refused to assume Confederate war debt. So if a state had debt because of being a Confederate state, the federal government refused to take over that debt. So those are the 4 parts of the 14th Amendment, the second of the 3 Civil War amendments that you need to know. So make sure you have all 4 of those things copied down. So suddenly, moderate Republicans decided to join in with the radical Republicans. Black Southerners and Southern Unionists were being mistreated in the South, and because of that, the moderate Republicans wanted to join with the radical Republicans, and that gave the Republicans even more power. So we come to the Reconstruction Act of 1867. It did 5 total things, and you're going to need to know all 5 of those things. 2 of them go together, so they'll be in a bullet point together. So first, it divided the South into 5 military districts, and that means that martial law was in the South. Basically, the military was in control of the South. State governments didn't exist at this point in time, and so the military was in control of local government. These are the 2 things that go together. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 gave blacks voting rights, but it also prohibited former Confederates from voting. So it's giving voting rights to a huge group of people, but it's taking voting rights away from a huge group of people as well. Next, it required the states to hold open conventions, and these conventions, the purpose of them was to draw up new state constitutions based on guidelines that Congress had created so that the southern states would be able to rejoin the Union and be official states again. And the final part of the Reconstruction Act of 1867 was that the states had to ratify the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship to everyone living in the United States. So these 5 parts of the Reconstruction Act needed to be put into place in order for a state to rejoin the Union, and then the troops would be withdrawn from the state. So people who had served in the Confederacy were excluded from helping these states start over. So I'm sure you can imagine that they were upset, they felt disenfranchised, they felt left out, and if they're not allowed to participate, they're not going to want to do things that are going to help the community to rebuild. So there were probably a lot of unintended consequences that happened. People who didn't have representation before the war, like Southern Unionists, Northerners who had moved to the South, and Black Americans suddenly had a whole bunch of power that they didn't have before. So Black Americans had a view towards voting rights. They didn't want people like former Confederates excluded from voting rights, but that's what was happening with the Reconstruction Act. So even the Republicans in the South wanted to limit the influence of Black Americans in politics. So we see the racial battle, the racial tensions going all the way back to the Reconstruction era. All right, so now we have two groups of people that we need to define. The first one we're going to define is carpetbaggers. So carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved south to help during the Radical Reconstruction. Now the reason I said help is because some of them truly did want to go and help rebuild the South. But some of them also went for financial gain because they saw a situation where they were going to be able to make a whole bunch of money for themselves. The attitude in the South towards carpetbaggers is they were hated and they were resented. So carpetbaggers, you didn't want to be called a carpetbagger. The other name that we need to understand is scallywags. So scallywags were white Southerners who supported the Radical Reconstruction. Basically Unionists, former Whigs, people who supported the radical plan for Reconstruction, and these people were viewed as traitors. So they were also hated. Make sure you have the definition for both of these two groups of people, carpetbaggers and scallywags, because you're going to need to know who they were and you're going to need to know the difference between the two. All right, so now we come to the impeachment of President Johnson. So even though President Johnson didn't agree with the agenda of the Radical Republicans and he tried to veto their plans, when they passed, he still followed the Constitution and enforced the laws as they had been passed. So that didn't stop the Radical Republicans, though, from wanting to impeach President Johnson. Now remember, impeachment is the process by which a president can be removed from office. But bottom line, and you need to write this down, the Radical Republicans wanted to impeach Johnson because they were unhappy with him politically. The Radical Republicans wanted to impeach President Johnson because they disagreed with him politically. Let me say it one more time. The Radical Republicans wanted to impeach President Johnson because they were upset with him politically. If we had time, if we were in class, we would talk more about impeachments and compare this particular impeachment to the impeachment of President Trump that happened in January of 2020, but we're not, so we can't. So we got to keep moving on with the Reconstruction. So the first thing that the Radicals did to try and get President Johnson removed from office was they passed this new act, the Tenure of Office Act, and they made it illegal to remove any cabinet appointee without the Senate's approval. So basically, it was a test for President Johnson to see what he would do. Well, President Johnson removed Secretary of War Edwin Stanton from office. The Secretary of War was a cabinet-level position, and President Johnson wanted him removed because he was against President Johnson and was openly siding against the president and siding with the radicals, so he was not a helpful person to have in President Johnson's cabinet. So President Johnson removed him, and the radicals were like, yes, we finally have him. So the radicals thought they had President Johnson. He had violated the Tenure in Office Act. And impeachment charges were brought against President Johnson for violating the Tenure in Office Act. But remember, what are the only things that a president can be impeached for? think back several chapters to when we studied the Constitution. That would be treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. Is going against the Tenure in Office Act treason, bribery, or a high crime or misdemeanor? I hope you said no, because that would be the correct answer. No, President Johnson had not committed treason, bribery, or high crimes or misdemeanors, so he shouldn't have been removed from office. So there you go. Impeachment is to bring charges against a public official in an attempt to remove them from office. Ultimately, President Johnson was impeached. Remember, that's the part that happens in the House, but he was not removed from office. That's the part that happens in the Senate. And so later on, 20 years later, the Tenure in Office Act was declared unconstitutional. So ultimately, President Johnson was not removed from office. He was impeached, but not removed. President Johnson was impeached, but not removed from office. Every other president that has gone through the impeachment process has had the same thing happen to them. They've been impeached by the House. So this would be President Johnson, President Bill Clinton, and President Donald Trump were impeached by the House, but then when the vote went to the Senate, the president ended up not being removed from office. In President Johnson's case, the one vote decided, you know what? Things would be way worse if the vice president took over, so let's just keep things the way they are, wait for the election to happen, and we'll go from there. So the Tenure in Office Act was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court 2 decades, 20 years later. All right, so we're going to spend a few moments talking about foreign affairs during this time period. President Lincoln wasn't really able to do much with foreign affairs because he was in the middle of fighting a war, but President Johnson did have some things he had to do. First of all, France's Napoleon III had set up Archduke Maximilian as a puppet ruler in Mexico, and this violated the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said that no European country was able to interfere in a government in the New World. And so by France putting a ruler in Mexico, that would be violating the Monroe Doctrine. So President Johnson sent 50,000 troops to the border between the United States and Mexico, and the French troops were forced to evacuate. So President Johnson was able to do something good in foreign affairs, and he enforced the Monroe Doctrine. Also, President Johnson bought Alaska. So he's responsible for purchasing Alaska from Russia for $7 million in 1868. So the press, though, thought that this was stupid, this was ridiculous. Why did the president purchase this piece of land? But now we have Alaska, and it actually is a good thing. And the final thing, it was called Seward's Folly because they thought it was ridiculous. And finally, another good foreign policy that happened under President Johnson was a treaty with commerce treaty, so trade treaty between the United States and China. So another good thing that ultimately happened under President Johnson. Then we come to the election of 1868. Obviously, the Republicans are not going to want Johnson to continue to be the President of the United States, so they selected Ulysses S. Grant as their candidate, and he ended up defeating the Democrat candidate, which was New York Governor Horatio Seymour. So Ulysses S. Grant won the election of 1868. The thing that decided this election was the black voters. So the fact that the former slaves were able to vote in this election made it so that President Grant ended up becoming the next president. Unfortunately, President Grant's legacy is that his time was marked with corruption, and it wasn't necessarily because President Grant was corrupt, but it was because the people around him and his advisors were corrupt. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about his presidency. because while Grant was president, the 15th Amendment, so the third of the three post-Civil War amendments, were passed. And again, you're going to need to know what this amendment did. So it prevented states from denying the right to vote to any person on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. But note here, it doesn't say anything about gender. So women were still denied the right to vote until we get to the 19th Amendment. So the 15th Amendment made it so that Republicans would stay in power for a very long period of time because the former slaves noticed that the Republicans were doing good things for them as a group, and so they're going to continue to vote for Republicans to stay in office. All right, that is all. That is the end of lecture. I'm sorry that I can't see you guys. I will miss you, and I hope that you have a great summer and that you are successful when you go on to high school. So, bye guys.